I'm Jonathan Tonkin from the University of Illinois. This is the last lecture in this series. I'm going to be using this opportunity to try and sketch out what the 21st century might look like in terms of sustainability. Where are we headed? Well, in the very first week, I discussed the concept of growth curves and how that there are some J growth curves and S growth curves. J growth curves inevitably lead to a crash because whatever the carrying capacity is, they always blow straight past it. Whereas S growth curves can asymptote toward a steady state, towards that carrying capacity. So we might ask ourselves then, if we're thinking about sustainability in the 21st century, which of these two patterns we're more likely to be on? Well, let's look at some real growth curves then. This is from the United States. Energy use is flat, carbon dioxide emissions are down, car travel is down. Thanks to a transfer from coal to gas, carbon dioxide emissions have dropped even as the price of energy has decreased. Air pollution, like sulfur dioxide, is way down. All this is despite the higher population and affluence as measured by GDP. Note that this is not the prediction of an IPAT analysis. Is this the whole story, however? In some ways, the world is on two tracks. There's the developed world track and the developing world track. Developed world countries use lots of resources, but at a static and sometimes declining rate. In some cases, the amount of absolute increase is zero. Japan's population, in fact, is predicted to be a third lower in 50 years. And so we could predict that Japan will be using less resources then than it does now. These observations about the developing world have led to some new ideas. One of these is dematerialisation. This is the process by which less material is used to deliver the same function. Compare an electric file of a textbook versus an actual physical book. This is an observed trend in the developed world. Cars are more efficient or even shared. We've seen plenty of examples in this course of increased efficiencies. There's better use of energy than there used to be in the past. And there's less use of water now in the United States than there was in the 1980s. One estimate suggests that between 1980 and 2005, a French consumer enjoyed 50% more affluence, but used only 20% more energy. So this isn't just restricted to the United States. This is something that we see in most developed economies. This isn't just a theory. There are lots of other observations that line up with this idea. Some commentators have spoken about peak oil, but there is also peak travel, peak steel, peak stuff. Take farmland in the United States. We use less farmland now in the United States than we have in the last few decades. In fact, peak farmland occurred in the 1950s. In fact, we use a comparable amount of farmland as we did as at the start of the 20th century. The population in the United States has grown from 80 million to 300 million in that time. I spoke previously about peak vehicle travel in the United States. This isn't just restricted to the United States. This is seen in many other countries as well. It's been observed in Britain, Germany, France, Japan. From 2005 to 2008, every year in the United States, the amount of vehicle miles travelled per person dropped. As of 2008, the average American is driving about the same distance that they did in 1998. We have this other idea of peak stuff. Beyond some point of consumption, people stop buying new things. Maybe they don't have the space for it, or they don't have the need for more material objects in their houses or in their lives. The British environmentalist Chris Goodall, for example, argues that people in the United Kingdom are actually consuming less material goods now than they were in the 1990s. According to the data from the UK Office of National Statistics, the total material requirement peaked at 2.17 billion tonnes in 2001 and has fallen by 4% in 2007, even though GDP rose over that period. So people were more affluent, but they had less things, they had less material things. And of course, material things have an impact on the environment. Water use is down, travel and car ownership use is down, metal and paper use is down, calorie consumption is down and meat eating is falling in the United Kingdom. So this is not the sort of trends that we would associate with a J-curve growth or an exponential growth. This is true elsewhere as well. It's been observed in the US and Germany. A good example of this is that the amount of material going to landfills in the United States is less now than it was in the past. This is sometimes described as an environmental Kuznets curve. In this case, the hypothesis is that countries get wealthier, they move through a transition from when they begin, when they're poor, little pollutants are made, and then as they grow richer, more and more pollution is created. But then past a certain threshold point, the amount of pollutants actually decreases. So if countries can transition from being poor to being rich, they can move from being low polluting to high polluting and back to low polluting. There are some different sets of data that back this up. One famous example is sulfur dioxide. As the United States got wealthier through the 20th century, the amount of sulfur dioxide emitted by American industry increased. But it peaked in the mid-century. Then, due to environmental laws and the concerns of individuals, it was decreasing all the way through to today, and it's continued to drop into the 21st century. This has actually not just been observed in the United States. Sulfur dioxide emissions follow the same pattern all around the world. There's this idea that if you have around $5,000 per person in per capita income, you have a peak in sulfur dioxide production. And as you get wealthier than that, the amount of sulfur dioxide that a country produces actually starts to fall again. We could apply this environmental Kuznets curve to other environmental issues. One idea too might be that we talked about population, and it appears that population growth occurs in this narrow band between wealthy and poor countries as the country transitions to a more developed state. This curve is controversial, however. Notice how it is really empirical. It's based on observation, not on underlying theoretical concerns. It could be that it's not so much that it's an increase in wealth that makes the environmental impact come down, but just the passage of time. Of course, in the United States, we saw a growth in wealth at the same time as the 20th century progressed. It could just be that as people became more enlightened or technology improved, or people became more socially aware of environmental issues, that there was the demand to drop these emissions. And so it's not actually to do with wealth so much as a process of time. Another real concern is that it appears that the environmental Kuznets curve doesn't apply to all environmental variables. Let's think about calorie consumption, for example. As we get wealthier, that increases at a slower rate, but it still increases. More seriously, we might worry about things like carbon dioxide production, because that changes the nature of the climate. That appears to increase at a slower and slower rate, but nevertheless still increase as countries become wealthier. So instead of seeing the curve bend back over, the curve remains quite flat, and so even wealthy countries are very polluting. In fact, the wealthier the country is for carbon dioxide, the more it pollutes. Another good example might be steel production. Steel production is showing no signs of a Kuznets curve right now. This could be due to building growth in countries like China, but nevertheless, even developed countries like the United States are still using a lot of steel. So it could just be that the impact of increased wealth, instead of moving down towards lower emissions, in another way just reaches a steady state. So very wealthy countries are no worse for the environment than merely wealthy countries. Critics of peak stuff actually see these sorts of arguments as determinative. They take the observation that developed countries use so much resources that any talk about a dematerialisation is overselling the case, and that there might be a slight decrease or might be a slight change, but really the rate is so high that this change is immaterial. And there's another reason to think that there won't be a universal Kuznets curve for the 21st century. As we saw in the population module, most of the growth in the 21st century is going to happen in developing countries. So these are countries that have not reached that point where they might start to decrease their levels of consumption. Developed world countries use far more resources per person, but the rate of change in that growth is much lower than for developing countries. So developing countries are using less resources, but those resources are being used at a growing rate. Perhaps there is a hopeful side to this, however. Developing countries needn't go through the same development process that the industrialised countries of today had to go to reach their current state. They can leap straight into more efficient developed technologies. Famously, many African countries aren't installing fixed telephone wires, for example. They moved straight to mobile phones. Other examples could include improved developments of farmland utilisation. It's been estimated that if the productivity of the world's farmers on an average basis was raised to the current level of farmers in Iowa, a world of 10 billion people could be fed an American diet on about half the farmland being used now. That's to show the incredible difference in yields and efficiency between the very peak farmers and the world average. So if we can use these sorts of technologies and spread them to these quickly developing, quickly growing developing countries, then we might be able to avoid some of the worst impacts of industrialisation. Another thing that I would add is that this all appears to be somewhat organic. In a sense, the system seems to run itself. If we think about the 20th century, we can see a history of world wars, other disasters including flu pandemics, and social and economic upheavals including the Great Depression. All of these events, no matter how large they were, did little more than slow down the trend lines that were established for the countries that were developing through the 20th century. So we might expect, barring some global level catastrophe, that these sorts of trends will continue. We might have a recession, we might have a local war, but in all of these cases, the trend line for the 20th century suggests that the 21st century's progress will just occur naturally from the system itself.
Produced by OCE Atlas Digital Media at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign.